Welcome everybody to this final session of the data versioning working group, recommendations and next steps. So we had already presented our recommendations and submitted them to a community review where we received a number of comments. And the documents that are now linked in the notes are the updated reports and collection of use cases. So this group was led by Leslie Wyburn, Ming-Fang Wu, Julia Martin, Ari Azmi, Robert Downs, and myself. We were hoping to present this in person in Melbourne, but it didn't happen. So now we're distributed all over the world across different time zones. So good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night to wherever you are. And as we start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, sea and waters of the area that we live and work on across Australia, and to say that we acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. The agenda for this session is pretty concise. We will present the data versioning working group report and our recommendations, talk about a few of the use cases. We have in total 39 different use cases contributed by the community, which was absolutely great, and that supplied us with many examples of what is already current practice and where the obstacles are and what things we should be looking out for. And at the end of the session, we want to discuss what the next steps might be. Should we need more use cases? Should we apply for a kind of maintenance mode to keep collecting use cases and examples of adoption of the recommendations? Should this work be continued in another working group, or is it done and we can turn to other things? So the final report was submitted to the Research Data Alliance Technical Advisory Board on the 16th of January of this year. And then we had a community review period that ran from the 28th of January until the 28th of February, where we had 1,865 views of the document, which is pretty good. And we received 2 comments in writing and some other feedback that was incorporated into a revised version of the report. And this final report and the data versioning principles that we formulated are based on the collection of 39 use cases that were contributed by members of the community. The use cases, I think, reflect very well the current practices from data providers. We analyzed these 39 use cases in the context of this data versioning working group, but also registered them with the RDA use cases group for future work in other RDA groups. So there's a long list of people from different organizations and countries who contributed, and I will not read all the names now, but that doesn't mean I don't want to thank everybody who contributed, because without these contributions, we wouldn't have gotten nowhere. And so let me do a quick recap of the principles that we formulated after analyzing the use cases. So as the first step, we recognize that there's a version control that's happening. And we call this revision. And what this revision process does, it identifies each change. And this is something that the dynamic data versioning working group had already worked out. But in trying to apply the dynamic data versioning principles, we discovered that those dynamic data versioning principles didn't explain what versioning meant, that it led some open questions. And so even though the revision principle was covered by them, we recognized that there's something else that they didn't convey, and that is the significance of the change from one revision to the next. And this process in data production is more of an editorial process, a decision where you decide that you want to release this particular revision as a new version. And this is also not unknown, but not so it hasn't been termed explicitly so. But we see this reflected in semantic versioning, the kind of versioning numbering that I think you all are familiar with version 1.0, 1.1, 1.11, where the different positions of the version numbering tell you something about the significance of the change. But then we also have aggregated objects and collections, and the question of granularity. And so we also, in this report, we also talk about how we identify collections of objects, time series, and aggregates. And something that we kind of discovered in discussing the work, the use cases, was that also sometimes data don't change in content, but they change in format. And that could be something as simple as presenting a picture as a JPEG or a PNG, or a satellite scene as a GeoTIFF or NetCDF. It's still the same content, it's still the same thing that's supposed to be expressed in there, but it comes in a different form. And this is something that we call the manifestation, that identifies different formats of the same work. So I'm using here some terms now, work and manifestation, that Leslie Wyburn, I think, will talk about shortly. Just the last point is that we know that there's been a lot of work around provenance. And so we see that sometimes we're dealing with derived data sets, where one data set was derived from some precursors. And it is important to also give information about how this object was derived from a precursor object, so the whole provenance story. Leslie, can I hand over to you to explain the model that we use to tease all of this apart?
Oh gosh, I thought you were going to do this horrible bit. As you'll see, some of our use cases were incredibly complex. The idea that someone produces a data set and that goes with the report, this linear approach, and then that may be versioned, was certainly not very common in the use cases that were compiled. And we were actually seeing data sets that were produced by one organization, and then another version was produced by another organization, and so on and so forth. And then you went to like complex data sets in NetCDF, go to GIS products like a GeoTIFF for an online GIS product. And it was getting really complex. And in our research, or it was Jens that suggested that we use this system called functional requirements for bibliographic references, or nicknamed FRBR, which was actually developed in the 1990s by the library community, more for books. And so, like, you've got Tolstoy's War and Peace, and then, you know, how many versions of that are around in different languages, in different book forms. Or if you go to Wikipedia and look up FRBR, they have a beautiful example based on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so what they were arguing was that you have something that is the original work. It's a distinct intellectual creation and it's abstract. Okay, so like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or as you'll see, the ASTER data set, that's the start. And then from that, you can have multiple expressions. So like when Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony, he didn't get it right the first time. He had a few versions and revisions, etc., which were expressions of his original concept. And data products are that expression. Next. And then, as we said, you've got that sort of product like the ASTER mineral maps of Australia, which are originally in a thing called a BSQ format, which was then put out as a GeoTIFF, which was then put out as a net CDF. And they're not all produced by the same organisation. Somebody just takes the work and reformats it to suit their particular use case. And then the next thing that happens, and this is where it's getting really complicated in today's world, is that damn thing called the internet. Because it becomes so easy for people to copy a data set and put it up on the web and, you know, make another copy of it. And so the poor user coming along just doesn't know whether they've got the authoritative version. If it's a copy, has it been kept in sync with the original version? And so really, again, I used to do a fair bit of work on provenance. And what I found was hard to apply provenance was that what you actually called an original work or a derivative or an equivalent was quite complex. And these terms were actually all conceptual model. It actually been worked out by the library community. And so what we did was we then said, okay, all right, can we apply this to the digital world? Now, when we first started this work, we were just trying to mechanically differentiate different versions. But where it started to become critical was I started to see a push. I was involved in the AGU FAIR data project, where we brought together researchers and funders, etc. And the funders were actually saying, you know, if we fund a major piece of work, a major data collection, we want to actually see where our investment has gone to, what impact does it have, how much uptake does it have of the data. So do you actually look at the original data set, or, you know, you've got the creation of model data sets along what we now call the full path of data. And this is different to the data life cycle, because I'll show that further on, but the full path is a data set as it evolves through time. Now, what we also then found was that not only were the funders getting a bit upset because they could not see where their investments were going, researchers, say like with geophysics data, went out and dug the holes and did all the original data, brought the instrument data back, calibrated it, and then people derived products from their calibrated data. They also were being left out of the picture. They had no identity in this whole system. And so next slide, please. I want to actually take you through this ASTER data set, which is one I've been working with. And as you can see, again, as I said, someone's gone out and created the work. And so someone thought about the Japanese space system. They put this really U-Butte instrument in 1999. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of scenes that have been collected with that. And as you know, you get the raw instrument data at L0. It's then processed and calibrated up to L1, L2. This is what any collector of data does. So if you think of data on an analytical instrument, you have to go through a phase where you process that raw data and apply calibrations and corrections to it. So that's out there in the public, funded by NASA and Japan. And then a group in Australia, multiple organisations were involved, about 10, I think, took 3,500 of these L1, BL2 scenes and created an Australian mosaic at continental scale. Then they took that and produced these L4 geoscience mineral maps, and they were made in different formats to suit usability. So BSQ for the professionals, net CDF for the high performance people, and GeoTIFF for the people that wanted to use it in a GIS. And then these products are now available from at least 10 different websites. So it's quite a complex data path. in which, as you can see, you've got multiple versions of that original work. And how do we get them into some form of structure where we can identify who's derived from what, and more importantly, know who did the original work? And then through judicious use of identifiers, be able to trace through all these different versions. Next. And so here you can see this data path where the original work is the ASTER mission, which is expressed as the level 0, 1A, 1B, 2 data done by one group. Then we have this Australian initiative taking over that did the level 3, the level 4, and then created these mineral maps. And we're saying they're all individual expressions of that work. The individual maps were then manifested in the 3 formats, and then the items are on all these websites. And so I worked for the organisation in the bright yellow down the bottom there, and I was kind of tasked with trying to say, well, what's the metadata record that goes with this data set? And I ended up with a very, very confused picture of where these NetCDF files had come from, because they were a different version to me of what was available on the other sites and the other versions in the pink and the green. Next. And what I found this FRBR model did was it helped with reproducibility. It made me know the source of any version that was used. I could then construct the sequential history. So instead of having to write a really long prose statement about this data was derived from that data, what you could do is if you had identifiers and proper metadata attribution on each version, then you just said this was derived from the previous one, the previous one, the previous one. But what was critical was it also enabled us as to identify which person or organisation had funded and or created and or produced. But more importantly, and this is something that people are forgetting, and it came out in these other sessions that we've been having, it's the repositories. And they're not just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. It costs money for them to curate data, keep it up to date, migrate it on technologies, etc., etc. And in many cases, they're just being left out of the sequence. And so they can't justify their existence because they can't show what role they've played in the preservation of some of these data sets. And again, coming from a large data center, I can assure you, it's not just a matter of sticking a data set on Amazon and getting a DOI on it. It doesn't work that way. If it's going to be able to be reusable and repurposed in scientific endeavors, then we've got to have a bit more, what can I say, structure around what we do. Next. And so again, based on that system we had of the work, the expression, the manifestation, and the item, each one of those can have either a person or a corporate body that is created, realised, produced, or owned. So again, all this information modelling has been done by the libraries, and all we did was take it to bring it into this system and then develop these principles which have, as you like, the map behind them based on this. Next. And further does this content relationships where a data set can be an equivalent. And I want to know if I'm going somewhere to get a data set that it's a copy of the authoritative one. Okay, so is it an equivalent or is it a derivative? And we stopped short in the thing. That's why we only had principles. We didn't do definitions or procedures, etc. We just said principles. Because what we actually said was, and we noticed this in the use case, where someone said it was equivalent or derived, it's sort of like a moving feast, as this figure shows in the yellow bit, where you progressively are making modifications or changes to that data set. But when it becomes a completely new derivative one, is a matter of policies for the group that is producing the data set. The other important thing is firstly, the block on the right called descriptive, and you're seeing that where you've got, say, pictures or reports of a data set, and they go with the data set, they're essential. And so you can actually attach that in this model to the actual digital work. And that can remain changed from like a metadata record to something as a, a full manual. And then over on the left, you've got some ideas of, what is an equivalent. Now, again, this is very heavily biased towards a paper world and the digital, the library books, but you can sort of see how you can take some of it to come through. Sorry, Jens, can you go back one? No, back. And so here I've just put in a comprehensive thing that's about 160 pages, which is quite an effort to go through if you are interested in it, but it gives you the full bottle. Next. And in this one here with Barbara Tillett, it's just a little brochure about 5 or 6 pages, as well as I see, thank you, Steve Jones, for putting the Wikipedia in, because both of them give you the idea of the concepts of how we were structuring these data sets. And increasingly, the data sets are getting more and more complex. And one thing that we also notice at NCI is with increased computational power, you can actually generate a new version of a data set in a matter of hours. And I can think of examples in geophysics where, when I used to work in Geoscience Australia, to create a compilation of all geophysics data sets in Australia would take 1.5 years. I think the first Landsat image we produced of Australia was like a 3-year epic. Whereas now with data cubes, data arrays, and that, we can create new versions much, much more quickly, and they're proliferating. And so this is why we were getting into the complexity of some of the use cases and needed to go to this FRBR model to get a bit more structure into what we were doing. Next. Okay, so I just wanted to show you so you understand where we're coming from and why it's important. And I'm not being judgmental on either CSIRO or the DEA group, but this is actually what's happening out in the real world. So here on the left is the data set on the CSIRO data access portal, and it has a DOI. If you look down, the credit is this Geological Survey, CSIRO GA. Organizations involved includes the Japanese and NASA. And the attribution statement includes all the key authors that were involved in it. As an example of a descriptive product, a la the FRBR model, there is the product notes, and this is the definitive reference with a DOI. Next. However, when you go to on the Digital Earth Australia, you've got quite a different picture. So DEA is a aggregator of all digital data of Australia. Satellite data, and ASTER is the top one of this list. And if you go over to the right, there are those 17 mineral maps, and here is the product notes, which doesn't have a DOI and has a GA website with no reference back to the original authors. More importantly, if you go down to the bottom on the copyright statement, it says all material on this website is Creative Commons by Geoscience Australia. And that's a common thing that's happening, that all the data suddenly that's on a website gets credited to a certain organisation. And you're not seeing the history, but more importantly, the repositories that the data is sitting at. It's just kind of not mentioned. And yeah, it's something that led to these 2 buffs, which probably Jens might give a bit of a summary when I've finished, where we're looking at, the republication of data and, what are the ethics about it? How do we do the accreditation? bearing in mind that if you do put the data on these different websites, you're increasing the exposure of that website, but you're not helping the reproducibility, and you're not helping expose the identity of the people without whom you would not have that particular version of the data set that you want to use available. Next. And so what we found with the PIDs was that we can trace the origin of each version, determine whether it's a replicate, derivative, or descriptive, and enables identity and attribution. And I'm just going to be really bold because we've been mucking around the last two plenaries at RDA saying, well, where do we go next? Is it something about we start to get concrete and develop the best practices for publishing and inversioning on the web that considers reproducibility, provenance, and above all, attributed identity, and allows replication of data to multiple sites without us losing that valuable information that we need. Next. And so we come back to where we started. And as I said, having done this full path of ASTER data use map, I think I can actually now, through judicious use of identifiers, etc., trace this back and know where my products come from, but more importantly, be able to put identifiers in and have it as a mineable asset that we can trace. Well, hang on, I'm over here with a data product in NetCDF, but it came from an original investment of that work by JSS, Japanese Space Systems, in the ASTER mission. Next. Over to you, Jens.
Thank you, Leslie. I think before we discuss next steps, we should take some time to answer questions, because this is a complex topic, as we see, and there's new concepts that we have to get our heads around. Leslie mentioned the session that we had 12 and 24 hours ago about the data republication and the questions of authority, identity, and ethics that are connected to that. And there's still a rich load of material that we have to work through to really get to all the points. The main points that stuck with me were that there's one question about, which might be the simpler question, about licenses and expectations. So that there's a difference between the community norms that we adhere to when we deal with other people's works, and then the legal licenses that are designed to make data sharing and data integration easy. So in short, the licenses permit far more than our community codes permit. And this matter is something that I think needs some expectation management, but is easier to resolve than the other question of how do we give credit to the stakeholders who were involved in creating a work and its expressions and manifestations. We have to move on from the idea that there's a publication associated with one data set. This has always been an oversimplification, but certainly we see that through data compilations that are very useful, the whole question of attribution becomes quite complex. So in that space, we need to work out how we want to move on. But now back to the data versioning principles. Let me have a look at the chat to see what what the questions might be that we need to discuss now. So Raina Jenkins asked a question about derivative products. Raina, if you want to ask this question again.
Hi, so yeah, it wasn't so much a question as sort of a comment in that one slide where showing that where this Creative Commons licensing was suddenly appearing on one of the derived access points for a data set. And maybe that's true that the original data set had a Creative Commons licensing. I couldn't quite see that, but I certainly know of cases, other cases where Creative Commons licensing is applied in a derivative product when the original product was not Creative Commons and had like specific restrictions of use. So that's also like a concern. There's the attributions that aren't propagating, but also the licensing. So there's actually legal like issues going on.
Yes, and this was, again, as with provenance, as with licensing, like I thought versioning when I started this was just a nice thing to have, so it was a structured world and I knew what I was dealing with. As we progressed, this thing about a CC BY being stuck on something that was not originally CC BY, or sorry, a CC, because some cases I've seen CC0 put on top of something, but then the attribution changing to the organization of the website that's hosting the data. And yeah, there's a can of worms starting to emerge. And ARDC have actually put out a best practice guide on licensing. I'll try and find it while if the chat keeps going. But yeah, and then to me, the frustration was knowing who had been involved in the project. When I went to some websites, there was just no attribution of them at all, which again was the basis of what we had, that late breaking BOF that Jens talked about, like this morning and last night, or whatever part of the country you're in, world you're in. That was where people were actually copying data to their websites and then making it available from their websites and putting new DOIs on it. And so what are the ethics and legality about it? And again, if there's a CC BY expert on the CC expert on the chat, they will tell us that, yeah, well, that's actually what you can do in some cases of the CC licenses. But to me as a researcher, it worries me because I don't know then that I'm dealing with the definitive data set and that on these other copies, it has been properly managed.
So Saulius Crowley's note in the chat touches on both those questions. One is about that data, the metadata should actually formally state the license and data originator. So both of these need to be touched, and he suggests that a data set should be accompanied by a cryptographic digital signature and timestamp so that you can recognize it and claim it. That's an interesting idea. Saulius, do you want to explain that?
Yes, I would be glad to comment on this. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
So the idea was, I was thinking about similar problems like we were told right now. It's really a sad situation with the data sets that happen. But the same happens with source code of programs and even with preprints. So the idea is that when you release your work, be it a data set or text, you can apply to an independent certificate agency, issuer, who delivers you a timestamp. and signs it with their cryptographic signature. What this proves that at a given time in the history, you had this file. For example, you had a data set collected from a satellite, or you had a computed map, or you had a crystal structure or something. After that, nobody can say, oh, no, it's our data set because we had it earlier. No, if your timestamp is later on your data, then it's clear that yours is a derivative, and at least it was later. It also could have consequences for, let's say, patenting and such things.
Yeah, that's a very interesting aspect.
Yeah, and of course we need trusted entities that deliver cryptographic timestamps, like notary agencies, or just now occurred another idea, you can use blockchain for that. Because in blockchain, you record a cryptographic signature of your work. It's a small piece of information. And then the community confirms that they have seen that at the given point in history. After that, nobody can take your data set and say, it's our data set.
That is a very interesting idea that we should follow on, because I can see how this would technically work.
Technically, I think it's quite realizable. And organizationally, this adds extra work for data originators. But if we make this a rule in data publishing, like, for example, now in publishing a paper, you always add your authors, affiliations, references. I mean, it's a matter of course, nobody just discusses this. And all papers, therefore, are attributable. Okay,
so,
no longer enough. So if the same would be a standard practice for data sets, then I think it would really make it easier both to find data sets, to see which is related to which one, and in case of disputing. Yes, and indeed, Hans has a very good comment. The hashes and signatures on data sets ensure that they were not changed, either not tampered with deliberately or not corrupted during transmission or storage.
I will ask Hans in a moment to give us a bit more comment on that. But I also want to point out that what I think we've learned a lot about the way data are presented through portals, because in the very early days, before DataCite existed, in this precursor, we discussed whether we would want to add a cryptographic hash to the metadata entry to make this process of verification easy, but then decided against it because just the character encoding would mess with the cryptographic hash, and subsetting would become a nightmare. I think we've progressed since then, so we should revisit this idea. I get the idea that Hans has thought about this already, so if you want to comment on that, Hans.
So let me see, I think I'm now can be heard.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I've been thinking about this matter of proving that data have not changed deliberately or otherwise for a long time. If we need to preserve data for a very long time, there are tons of reasons why data can change, and we should make sure that important data, that you always can prove that they have not changed. And if you have a number of copies around the world, you can find out which is the exact copy. There are examples already, even in natural sciences, that people have tried to undermine the work of scientists by doing all kinds of things. So it is, I think, very important to get a hold on that one, because people could deliberately want to make scientific work, let's say, lose their credibility. The other thing is, of course, you may know about the work at CERN about bit rot, which will happen. So even if you have 2 or more copies, you would need to revisit data ever so often to make sure that the hash has not changed in daily work, and maybe recover another copy, etc., etc. So it should be very important in practical work, not just for attribution.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd just like to make one comment, because it sort of has come up in the past. One of the things going through the use cases and through some of these portal websites, yes, there was actually a landing page and a full metadata record, but I could get direct into that data without, and completely bypass the catalog record. And once you had developed, you know, there was a link or a web page, you could just pass that around. And so it's also something that we need, you know, people's wanting to get the data quickly, they don't worry about the metadata record. And this is again why we're sort of leaning towards what is best practice, so people are aware of these pitfalls. Because I think some of it is just innocent. I don't think people realize that this is what's happening with the versions of the data that they're putting on their websites. Whoops, I killed the conversation.
No, we have a lot of things to think about now. This, because I think the discussion really took an unexpected turn. What I think we can see is that the data versioning question was quite fundamental to dealing with data. And now I have to find somebody's microphone that's not muted to kill the background noise. Because that was yeah, confusing me a little bit. Okay, so I think what we see is that versioning is really at the heart of many of our data practices, and the idea of using cryptographic signatures to help with the versioning practices is something that I don't remember from our use cases. Leslie, Ming, Robert, Ari, did we discuss that? Julia?
I vaguely remember there is a use case. Just go through the use case document now.
So, but what I think we need to do as well is to, well, point out the issues, the problems that we might encounter, but also potential solutions and how dealing with this could be made easy. Because what I think we should, what we need to balance here is to make data sharing easy, and at the same time address the valid concerns of the stakeholders involved in all these processes. So what we discussed in the data republication BOF was that it would be good to collect some user stories to understand the processes that are happening and the stakeholders or personas involved and how they are touched by these processes, what implications it has for them, and what would make the situation better. So I think we can start thinking about what do we want to do with this working group and its outputs. So I know what Leslie's going to say. We will close the working group.
No, I'm not going to say that. I'd just like to go procedurally. I guess this is absolutely the last chance because we now want to submit that report and the use cases to the working group. So, sorry, to the whatever process you go through. I can't remember what it is. And that will be final. And that technically ends this working group, which, don't forget, was a spin-off from a RDA versioning interest group.
That's right.
And so really why we did this was, it was people wanting us to say, well, can we develop a set of principles around which versioning can be based on, that gives us guidelines. And that's what these documents are meant to be, or one's meant to be. This is how we took everyone's use case that was presented and converted into something.
So you suggest that we should ask the question now whether there are any final objections that we shouldn't publish this as the updated final report?
Yes.
So there's a tool here in your that you can use to I just wonder where you see that on your screen, where you can click yes, no, go slow, go faster, or raise your hand. Can you see that? This an icon that you can click on? Yes, Ari has found it.
Trust Ari.
So use yes if you agree that that we should accept this report, or press no if you say that it needs a further revision. You can also abstain. Okay, that is 14 yes and no, no, and a lot of abstentions. So the yay have it.
Yay!
Thank you. And so that opens the door to the question, what do we do next?
Yes, Ari, perhaps my idea would be that we would go back to the interest group level and see what are in there, maybe develop the next step. Of course, this can be now had this discussion here, but I think that's how the RDA in principle works. But of course, if we really see now the next steps, what we need to do, I think it's not a good idea to wait for half a year and then go for next plenary to discuss this. But we can use this time here now to discuss it already.
Yeah, and I think we have less than a handful of options besides doing nothing and ending everything here. We can start an interest group, as Ari suggested, which would give us the space to explore more concrete work that we could then start as a working group. So the working group is another option. but a working group is limited in its lifetime. It's 12 to 18 months, and it has to have a clear kind of work order. It has to have mission to produce a product. And at the moment, we don't even know what we want to do. So starting a working group isn't, I think, the best option.
Maybe Francois can help us. Technically, we had an interest group, a RDA interest group, and we converted in, or we spun off this working group. I think technically the interest group's still there. So can we just go back to having the interest group? Maybe we need to check that with RDA. Well, Francois, can you unmute and let us know?
Yes, I can unmute myself. I thought Jens was above us to decide on these things, so thank you.
We would never cut you out, Francois.
No, I think you should. I don't have a cat to come, but you never know. So I think that you can, anyway, you don't have to wait for 6 months to propose a group, whatever you want to do. This is sure, you can propose anytime. If you had already an interest group, I just have to check, but my screen is a bit full with different things, especially because I am also taking your notes. So I think if you had an interest group, the interest group is still here. And if it's not, it's probably in historical status, and historical things can be revived. So you would not have to begin from scratch. And we have, I'm not sure there is a real procedure for the moment to reopen an historical group, but since it's still on the same topic and there are still similar, many people are still here from the beginning, I think it's probably not an issue. I would suggest that beginning by a working group, if you don't really know what to do, it's not a good idea because the working group is limited in time. So an interest group is a good place to do that if you manage to keep a momentum in the interest group. But there are many interest groups which have a momentum for discussion and decisions and so on. So I can check what is the status of the interest group and write something in the chat if it's useful. But in any case, I really think that if you want to continue, I guess that even a working group could be transformed into an interest group if needed, because there are several options at the end of a working group. So you can decide to stop, you can decide to go to maintenance mode, just to be here to update and get feedback and so on. Or you can decide to, I think you can decide to transform it in an interest group if you wish, probably with a fast track but I will check the status of the interest group, if there is an interest group already, and I think there was. I think you probably remember better than me, and you said there was. So I check and I write something in the chat, but someone has to take notes while I do
So
that.
yeah, thank you, Francois. We did start as an interest group after having a BOF and then after, I don't know, sometime as an interest group, started a working group with a more focused object and work description. And so then I understand that we can kind of fall back to the interest group mode and work out a mission for a more focused group if we want to do that.
What I would ask though is if you are going to do that, and I said this in Helsinki, I'm stepping down as a chair, so you're going to have to, we do need someone else to step up as a chair. And I see there's a couple of people who've said that they're interested in continuing. So I think it's Paula Martinez and Irina Vart from Slovenia. Seeing
And
you're the
also
only.
Saulius.
Oh yeah, there's a few that have put a 1. Okay, so
Yeah.
those that have put a 1 in the table, we might
it a
be
1?
contacting you about being a chair. Also, there's 30 names in the table, and which is in the notes, and the table asks, you know, how interested are you in continuing with this? So it'd be great if the remaining 17 of you could fill in your names. And
Even if
everyone,
you don't want to continue working in this group.
yeah. And then the next issue, of course, if we want to continue while we've got so many of you online, maybe we could use as an opportunity for you to say, well, what you think the most critical issue is about versioning that needs to be solved, and do we form a working group around that?
And then we have the outcomes from the BOF that we had earlier today, or whatever, 12 hours ago, 24 hours ago, that also raised a number of questions that we were considering putting into an interest group.
No.
Leslie, you're breaking up.
Okay.
Try again. Try again.
I was just going to say, put the link to the notes from the other 2 meetings in the chat box so people can see what was going on.
So if I can just give, sorry, if I can just give an update on the status of interest group, the previous interest group, I do not find it anywhere. So my understanding is that it was simply transformed into the working group. So it's not in historical status. It's just the working group is what was the interest group, which is what you remember. So I guess you can decide to go backwards and to tell, and we will see how to manage, but we will find a way to manage if you wish.
Thank you, that's great. We will take you up on that.
I've just put the notes from the meetings that Jens has been referring to, and that was very closely aligned to the versioning. You can see the topics and also the presentations that were given around that. So, I mean, clearly it's an open topic, and the number of people that we've had at these sessions on versioning just says the problem is still alive. Well, the issue is still alive.
Are there any more questions?
Not from me.
I think we have an idea of where we're going next. In terms of, we continue some form of work. We have some topics that arose from the BOF sessions and from this session. We will make the notes available, and also please let me know, and I'll just clear the voting. Is it okay if we make the recording of the session available? If it's not okay, please do let me know if it's not okay with you. But if I don't hear anything, we will make the recording of this session available. So one question here is, from Raina about the comments that we received, and the comments were mainly on us being not assertive enough in our recommendations. So we
Sorry, no, not really what I was trying to say. I was looking at the actual paper, and in the section where you guys have use cases,
oh yeah,
you have considerations for further iteration or prioritization. And number 5 was, is it possible to have a vocabulary of changes that results in a new version, so that a new version can be annotated
oh
with
yes,
standard
yes,
vocabulary?
yes. Mm-hmm.
And I am actually really interested in that idea, and I just wondered if there's, if that's like a potential direction to go as well here.
Yes, certainly, yes, that is a very good point. Because what we already tried with using the FRBR terms was to introduce more standardized vocabulary, and it does show that we need more of these kind of definitions, but as Leslie said, we didn't go into definitions, we stayed at the level of principles. But certainly that would be something for a continuation in another, or continuation of this group.
See, let's say we've got time. Historically, what we were going to do, this is an interesting story because I see a lot of people are here that haven't been at our previous meetings. The original aim of this group was to develop the use cases, synthesize them, and put them to the W3C data exchange working group. And one of the topics they were working on was best practices for publishing data on the web. And one of the key issues they were going to work on was versioning. And about 6 or 12 months after we started this working group, the W3C kindly told us that they were dropping versioning from their current revision because they found it was too complex. And so instead of having a working group that was developing an output that was going to be the input to the W3C, we're stuck with all this work that, you know, people contributed. Jerry Ryder of ARDC had done a brilliant job in synthesizing the use cases from RDA group so that they could go to the W3C group. And in the end, we just said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And so we said, let's stick it at higher level principles. Again, equivalent to like the FAIR principles, they're just kind of guidelines. And then that leaves the field open to then go into how you implement some of these things. Anyway, that's just a bit of background.
But it's also a nice segue into thanking everybody who was involved. So that's everybody who contributed the 39 use cases to the working group and joined the discussions. And then other use cases that we heard about. Also thank the RDA Secretariat and Technical Advisory Board liaison Stephanie Ketters and Tobias Weigel for the guidance and support, but also, above all, we really want to thank the Australian Research Data Commons for their support. Without the support in people that did a lot of the editing work and helped us get this all into a good shape, I think we wouldn't have gotten anywhere.
And I'd like to add also the 3 key people were Ming Fang, Jerry Ryder, and Julia Martin. They did a tremendous job because, as you can see, there's 39 use cases. So I don't know what, about 70 or 80 page document, and they were the ones that kind of pulled it together and synthesized it, and then made it easier for, you know, Ari, Bob, Jens, and I to start to distill what were the common patterns and things we could turn into principles.
Okay, anything anybody wants to add?
So, right, our next step is we will now submit this. Whew, thank goodness.
Yes.
I don't want to
And
see it again.
I see some notes in the chat about SQL versioning, and I'd like to point to the work of the dynamic data citation working group that published a set of quite a number of recommendations that are very well suited to versioning SQL and databases. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants, but there's still more to explore. So keep on exploring.
Okay, thank you everyone.
I think we can thank you, and as you said, all the people who did the job. So I will be able to provide information about the meeting if my colleagues from TAB ask about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
So,
thank you.
Then everybody, wherever you are in the world, morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, have a good day, afternoon, evening, night. Keep safe, keep well, and we hope to see you again in the not too distant future in person at one of our exciting meetings. Thank you very much, and do come to our forthcoming whatever the group's going to be called, online meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens and Leslie, for leading this.